Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Archivist of the United States, David S. Ferriero, and my good friend and colleague, the President of the Nixon Foundation, Hugh Hewitt, welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, and to the spectacular East Room of the Nixon Library. We'll begin today's program with the presentation of colors and the singing of the national anthem. Will all that are able please stand? Please rise to pay tribute to our flag and our country.
Say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ready, two. Right, face. Forward, march.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Please join me in expressing our gratitude to the American Legion's Newport Beach Post 1991. And to Melanie Pedro for that beautiful musical rendition of our national anthem. Thank you. I'm Michael Elzey with the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration and the Federal Director of the Nixon Presidential Library. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Nixon Library on this beautiful day, and I'm privileged to introduce our honored guest. Before I introduce the Secretary, I'd like to share with you why this privilege is so important to me personally. I was raised by a member of the greatest generation. My father, like his two brothers, joined the Navy immediately after Pearl Harbor, as did Americans all over the country at that moment in our nation's history. He was 19 years old. By the time he was 20, he was flying left seat in a patrol bomber in the European theater. During his career, he flew in Korea and during Vietnam. The content of the American character changed forever, beginning with the greatest generation. This country and its exceptionalism has been built on the service, sacrifice, hard work, and patriotism of our country's veterans and their families. Richard Nixon was a member of the greatest generation. He was a proud World War II veteran of the United States Navy. Not many things were more important to Congressman, Senator, Vice President, and President Nixon than his relationship with the United States Armed Services, its veterans, and during the Vietnam War, the safe return of America's long-held POWs. President Nixon enjoys a great legacy with our veterans. He ended the military draft and instituted the all-volunteer military force. He ended America's involvement in the Vietnam War with the January 1923 Paris Peace Accords. He brought the POWs home. On October 24, 1972, as the end of the Vietnam War drew near, President Nixon signed two major bills which guaranteed 29 million American veterans substantial benefits. These bills increased the GI Bill education allowance by nearly 26%, and they increased by 48% the rates paid to GI Bill trainees taking on-the-job or apprenticeship training. Upon signing these bills, President Nixon said the following: "By giving our veterans the gratitude and opportunity they deserve, we are not only doing the right thing for them, we are also doing the right thing for all of us. We can never fully repay in dollars, in training, and in medical service the patriotic sacrifices of the American veteran. But we can and we shall use this means of reaffirming our respect and gratitude toward them, and it is in this spirit that I sign these two bills into law." I'm a Vietnam-era Marine veteran, raised by a veteran and a member of the greatest generation. I've lived my life the way I was raised. I served President Nixon as my commander-in-chief, and I'm proud to be a veteran. It is for all these reasons that it is the privilege of a lifetime to introduce the Secretary of Veteran Affairs, Robert Wilkie. The son of a veteran himself, Secretary Robert Wilkie is the right person for the job at this challenging time in our country's history. Mr. Wilkie was overwhelmingly confirmed by the U.S. Senate and officially became the United States Secretary of Veterans Affairs on July 30th, 2018. He previously served in the Department of Defense as Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs. Mr. Wilkie served as Special Assistant to President George W. Bush and Senior Director of the National Security Council, working for National Security Advisors Condoleezza Rice and Stephen Hadley. He served in the United States Navy Reserve. Mr. Wilkie is currently a colonel in the United States Air Force Reserve. Mr. Wilkie holds an honors degree from Wake Forest University, Juris Doctor from Loyola University College of Law in New Orleans, Masters of Laws in International and Comparative Law from Georgetown University, and a Master's in Strategic Studies from the United States Army War College. Secretary Wilkie is an accomplished strategist and experienced public executive, and since his arrival at Veterans Affairs, a consummate doer. Remarkable things are getting done at the VA, and I'd like to share just a couple. We're 10 days into October, and just this month, the Department of Veterans Affairs has announced the President's roadmap to empower veterans and end the national tragedy of suicide prevents. Task Force hosted a healthcare leadership meeting at the White House to bring leaders from across the healthcare industry and discuss their role in changing the culture around mental health, substance abuse, and addiction. The VA announced that veterans can now enroll in the VA's Million Veteran Program, the MVP, which is integral to the Veterans Affairs effort to improve the lives of veterans through healthcare research and innovation. On October 5th, the Secretary was in LA to dedicate a new columbarium that will double the capacity of Los Angeles National Cemetery. Here in Orange County, veteran leaders hope to partner with the National Cemetery Administration at Veterans Affairs and the state of California to construct a state veterans cemetery at the former Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in the city of Irvine. Finally, but very fittingly for today's U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, on October 8th, the VA announced that Western Pennsylvania Continuum of Care met the requirements in September to declare the effective end of veteran homelessness in the 20 counties it served, a huge and consequential accomplishment in the fight to eradicate veteran homelessness. Secretary Wilkie is a doer. On January 20th, 1969, in his first inaugural address, President Nixon said, "The essence of freedom is that each of us shares in the shaping of his own destiny. Until he has been a part of a cause larger than himself, no man is truly whole. I'm sure the Secretary would agree this is the core fundamental tenet of the United States veteran. It's now my privilege to introduce, and please help me welcome, Robert Wilkie, the 10th United States Secretary of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much, and thank you for this very high honor. I am a child of the age of Nixon. One thing that we do share is our love of football. I am from the Deep South, where it is a religion. Although I, as was mentioned, attended Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where the football dorm is named after Arnold Palmer, which ought to tell you why we're the losingest team in the history of college football. But my son has made up for that. He is a student, engineering student at Clemson University, the champions. I had the opportunity to remind the Clemson football team that I was part of an organization that contributed to all of the great football records at Clemson's Memorial Stadium. The most points scored by Clemson in the first quarter, the most points scored by Clemson at halftime. They scored 87 points that day. They have a mascot, the tiger, who does push-ups to match the number of points that Clemson had scored during the day. So this was a very hot South Carolina afternoon, and in the third quarter, when it was 73-0, the tiger disappeared. We saw an ambulance come out of the Clemson tunnel. Tiger was in the end zone. His little tiger hat was off. His face was red as a Coke can. They carted him off. Clemson scored 87 points that day, and our coach, Al Groh, had his press conference. And there was one profound question asked at the beginning of the press conference. Coach, is there anything you can say about today's game? He said, yeah. Wake Forest killed that damn tiger. So it is a profound and singular honor for me to be here today. And I do want to talk about the man who probably did more for veterans than any president since Abraham Lincoln. But I want to talk a little bit about the whole man and look at his vision for America, a vision that we at the Department of Veterans Affairs, I hopefully believe, carry on to this day, some 45 years after Richard Nixon left the White House. But let's go back to those times. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, as Ariel Sharon's tanks crossed the Suez Canal to cut off the reeling Egyptian army from its home in Cairo, Leonid Brezhnev went public with a declaration that Soviet paratroopers were moving to their jump-off points to rescue Moscow's Egyptian client. Within 30 minutes of Leonid Brezhnev making that statement, the entire United States Sixth Fleet moved from its bases in the Mediterranean. That was Richard Nixon's response. So powerful that Golda Meir said that Richard Nixon was the best friend that Israel ever had. Apart from the permanently resentful on the academic left, few Americans would deny that Richard Nixon was the most formidable practitioner of the arts of diplomacy in modern American history. He opened China. He ringed the Soviet Union with adversaries. He paved the way for peace in the Middle East by bringing Anwar Sadat out of the Soviet orbit. He ended the war in Vietnam. His friend Ben Stein always said that his favorite phrase was, "We are sworn to create a generation of peace." President Nixon gave voice to a generation forged in wars against fascism and communism and steeped in the harsh diplomatic lessons of the 20th century. He represented the confluence of hard-headed practical politics with an encyclopedic knowledge of of the motivation of America's friends and enemies. I can remember as a child the electric effect that he had on my mother and her fellow Army wives. They talked about Nixon. They stuffed envelopes for Nixon. They knew he was one of us, and that if anyone could figure out Vietnam, it was the man who had stood with Eisenhower for 8 years. Watching the carnage on the streets of Chicago, my father, a young officer, and my mother jumped ship to vote for Richard Nixon, and they never looked back. In 1994, at this spot, Senator Bob Dole said that the second half of the 20th century should be called the age of Nixon. Senator Dole said that Richard Nixon was the most durable public figure of our time. He was a hero to that silent majority in America, like my parents, those who believe in the dignity and the importance of work, worship, and loving their families and saluting the flag. Senator Dole added that Nixon embodied the deepest feelings of the people that he led, and in his ultimate act of service became this century's greatest architect of peace. I can tell you from my perspective, both as the secretary of this wonderful department, as the child of a combat officer who was grievously wounded in the invasion of Cambodia, the effects of Richard Nixon's policy decisions and his elevation of the American veteran are felt by me to this day. As I mentioned, when I was 7 years old, my father was terribly wounded in the invasion of Cambodia. He was a big man for his day in 1970, 6'2", 240. Today, that's not even a quarterback, but in 1970, that's a big man. He spent a year recovering from his wounds in an Army hospital in Hawaii. And when he came home, he weighed half of what he did when he left the year before. As much as I was shocked by his appearance, those aren't the only memories of that time. I also saw Vietnam through the eyes of my elementary school and kindergarten classmates at Fort Sill and Fort Bragg, and I knew children who suffered great loss in Vietnam, whose fathers never came home. When one of my classmates was called to the principal's office, there was always a chance that that child would not be there for a doctor's appointment. There was a chance that there was very bad news from Southeast Asia. I also remember being told that my father, a senior officer in America's most decorated combat unit, the 82nd Airborne Division, was not allowed to wear his uniform off post because the public couldn't stand it. Ladies and gentlemen, that was not Berkeley, California, or Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was southeastern North Carolina, the heart of Nixon country. Richard Nixon ended the war in Vietnam, an important achievement that boasts of Bob Dole's claim that he was the ultimate architect of peace. Dr. Kissinger added a few years ago that by ending that war, Richard Nixon advanced the vision of peace of his Quaker youth that began just a few feet from where we are sitting. But Richard Nixon did more than that. He took a stand against the media, and he took a stand against the popular culture, misguided in its sentiment that said Americans who had fought in Southeast Asia were broken human beings, not worthy of the honors bestowed on previous generations of warriors. In those times, Americans forgot that their freedom was not guaranteed by pundits, professors, and protesters, but by the long line of 41 million of their fellow citizens who first put on the uniform when the shots were fired in April of 1775 on Lexington Green. Richard Nixon never forgot that. He signed legislation after legislation, boosting veterans, boosting education benefits, paying for veterans' apprenticeships, getting them started in small business. He said that his efforts was his way of reaffirming America's respect and gratitude toward those who serve. He openly praised America's warriors who served in Southeast Asia, saying that they had honorably undertaken and honorably ended that conflict. When he signed those various veterans bills, the highest number of veterans bills ever signed by any president, he said, by giving our veterans the gratitude and the opportunity they deserve, we are not only doing the right thing for them, we are doing the right thing for each of us. Each returning veteran is a precious American resource, a mature, highly motivated young citizen who has proven his capacity to serve and to achieve. These young men and women form the strongest hope for America's future. Richard Nixon rejected the counterculture, and he hosted the largest ever gathering on the White House lawn, a dinner for the returning POWs from North Vietnam. Under an enormous tent, Nixon personally greeted more than 500 men who had been held in Hanoi's prisons and who had come to the White House that day with their wives and their families. He openly dared the American press to criticize him as he congratulated the thousands of American airmen who had carried out his orders to carry the fight to the heart of North Vietnam to force Hanoi to say that enough is enough. He admitted to those in the audience that he had wondered if anyone in America had supported that decision. But the audience that mattered, the POWs and their families, rose as one. I can tell you this, Nixon said, after having met each one of our honored guests, and after having talked to them, I think that all of us would like to join in a round of applause for the brave men that took those B-52s to the skies and did the job. The POWs roared for 10 minutes, and only Nixon knew why. If they hadn't done it, you wouldn't be here tonight. Then he raised his glass and toasted all the wives and mothers of POWs across America and proclaimed them honorary First Ladies. So, was the second half of the 20th century the age of Nixon? I can categorically say that when it comes to veterans and peace, yes, it was. The president himself didn't preside over this nation at a time when America honored its warriors the way he had wished, but he never forgot who guarantees that freedom and never succumbed to the amnesia that blanketed this nation for a generation. It took years, but America would slowly shake off that dark time, thanks in part to the same men and women that Nixon had said form America's greatest hope for our future. With no parades or welcome home rallies to return to, those veterans pushed in the 1970s and the 1980s to build the Vietnam Wall in Washington. And slowly, this nation relearned Richard Nixon's wisdom, that these veterans are our heroes for shouldering the responsibility of protecting freedom, ours and that of our allies, whatever the result may be. So if our respect for veterans today counts for anything, along with working hard, worship, loving the family, and saluting the flag, one can safely argue that we are today living in the age of Nixon. Today we are, thankfully, a pro-veteran country. We see people standing for veterans at ball games. Videos of veterans surprising their children at school after a long deployment automatically go viral, and even most celebrities support our warriors. But as our past reveals, there is no guarantee that this will last. Support for our heroes is fragile, and we must do all that we can to make sure that we never return to the dark days of Vietnam. At VA, we are doing everything that we can to live up to the example that Richard Nixon set for veterans. Under the Mission Act, we have finally shown veterans the ultimate act of respect by giving them choices outside of VA for health care when they need it. The era of forcing veterans to drive for hours to the nearest VA clinic is over. They can now seek care when and where they need it. And thanks to the President of the United States, they now have access to urgent care, something incredibly that they had no access to until June 6th of this year. We are fitting this new VA into the vision of Richard Nixon. We deliver tuition assistance and job training to show, as Nixon said, the gratitude and respect that our warriors reserve. When Nixon toasted the wives and mothers of America's POWs, he called them the bravest and most magnificent women he had ever seen. He was right, and he would be right today. When my father was commissioned in the field artillery 2 months before John Kennedy was inaugurated, with a force of about 7 million in the ranks, less than 0.5% of that force was female. As the Undersecretary of Defense, the force I was responsible for was made up of 17% of American women. By 2025, that number will reach 20%. In the VA, we are welcoming. We are evolving to meet the needs of the modern force. 10% of those veterans who call our department home are women. In my home state of North Carolina, under Fort Bragg and just a few miles from Camp Lejeune, more than 20% of the veterans who use VA in my hometown are women. But I want to leave you with two other important things that we are doing to get to the core of what Richard Nixon was talking about, making sure that veterans can fully re-enter society in the nation they love and the nation that they had fought to defend. The first is suicide prevention. We have watched for years now as roughly 20 American warriors take their lives every day. President Nixon's kind words to America's warriors are incompatible with taking no action to help veterans who are at risk of harming themselves. That is why we are going beyond our aggressive efforts to help veterans in the VA and coordinating with state and local partners, charities, non-governmental organizations, veterans groups, faith-based organizations, and others so we can quickly identify veterans who may pose a risk to themselves and helping them get that help either inside or outside of VA. I want to add one other thing. I am not a medical professional. I've been referred to by some in the United States Senate as Forrest Gump because I refer most of my talking points back to the Roman Empire or some era in American history. If we pursue the prevention of suicide and just look at the last tragic act in a veteran's life, we are doing an injustice to all who have served our nation. If we don't finally begin a national conversation that Richard Nixon began in 1970 about mental disabilities, if we don't begin that national conversation about mental health, a place where we are not even at the Sputnik stage in this country, if we don't have a deep national conversation about addiction and homelessness, then we will be failing those we are sworn to serve. So your department, for the first time, is embarking on that national conversation with Indian Health, HHS, DOD, and the National Institutes of Health to finally create a whole of government, whole of medicine approach so that we no longer have to come back and say that there are 20 warriors a day who are departing through their own hand. It's time, past time, that we care enough about veterans, that we work with everyone that we can and stop waiting for those veterans to enter a VA clinic. Whatever else we owe our people, we owe them that much. And secondly, we are fighting the new intolerance of our time, an intolerance that President Nixon would have recognized, an intolerance that he fought within his own community because as a Quaker, he was not expected to go off to war to fight this country. We are fighting the intolerance of religious bigotry. Just a few months ago, we finally eradicated a policy that had been put in place that said no veteran in our department was allowed to have access to a Bible, to the Old Testament, or to any other religious document unless he actually brought that document in. Our chapels were bare. I have said that the spiritual well-being of our people is just as important as the competence of our doctors and nurses. The Bibles are now staying in our department and in our hospitals. So that brings us full circle. Bob Dole was right 25 years ago in this place when he said that the silent majority Nixon represented included those ordinary Americans who believed in the church and saluted the flag. Today, I believe that it is the duty of that silent majority to be a little less silent and to stand bravely in the public square as Richard Nixon did and declare what it knows to be true, and then patiently let the country catch up to that truth, however long it takes. So I will leave you with the words of the Reverend Dr. Billy Graham. Reverend Graham said of Richard Nixon that a tree is best measured when it is laid down. His humble roots through to his legacy have yet to be measured by the muse of history. But I am convinced that that muse will properly measure the life and genius of Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon will not be found wanting. So I thank you again. I thank you again for everything that you do for this country. I thank you for the great honor of allowing me to stand in the presence of a man whose life directed the course of millions and millions on this planet, and whose course we are still following today. Thank you all, and God bless.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Q&A session. We were distributing 3x5 note cards on the way in, and I have those note cards, and I will read them now. But I think it's important that I and the others of us in the room pay tribute not only to you as a serviceman, reservist in the Air Force, as a colonel, but to all that serve, all servicemen and women, and all veterans. Would you please stand and be recognized if you are indeed a serviceman and woman or a veteran? Thank you. And here's another card. But we will go through this. We are a little tight on time, so I'll read these as quickly as I can. The first question: there were probably multiple hardships you faced, but what were some of the greater ones, and how did you overcome them?
Oh, boy, that's an interesting question. I mentioned my father. I grew up at Fort Bragg and Fort Sill, and I watched several things. I watched soldiers coming home and being neglected. I watched a country that was indifferent. But I was privileged to live in a community represented by so many veterans here that perseveres, that never takes no for an answer. That the highest calling of life is to serve others. That was the example that I learned. I will tell you that I spoke at Arlington Cemetery on Veterans Day, and I mentioned my great-grandfather, My great-grandfather left a small-town law practice in Cleveland, Mississippi, to join up with the Army assembling at Camp Gordon, Georgia. Another part of that encampment was my wife's grandfather. He was 18. He'd never ventured much beyond 2 or 3 counties in North Carolina. But before his 18th year was over, he was marching up the Champs-Élysées into the horror of the Meuse-Argonne. Whatever obstacles that I had, I always leaned back on that history. I can have only imagined an 18-year-old boy from a farm on the North Carolina-South Carolina border marching past Notre Dame and into the hell of trench warfare. But I've been blessed. I've worked for, as was noted, some of the great public servants of the last 50 years. One who had a very strong tie to President Nixon, Donald Rumsfeld. Worked for Condi Rice, Bob Gates, Jim Mattis. The highest honor that I've ever had, though, is being part of the Department of Veterans Affairs, to really serve those who have served. And that is what keeps me going.
Thank you, sir.
But I will add, my first day working in the U.S. Senate, I worked for someone who was a good friend of President Nixon's. He actually had an office that opened up to Senator Nixon's office, Senator Helms from North Carolina. And he was reading my resume to me. He said, "Son, that is a magnificent Wake Forest resume. Politics and classical languages. You are qualified to be a tour guide in Rome and have long conversations with 90-year-old priests." So that's how my career started.
Our next question, sir. Almost 1/3 of all veterans live over 40 miles from the nearest
Yes.
VA medical center. What can the VA do to make it easier for them to use private providers closer to home?
Well, thank you. The Mission Act. President Trump, I think I would add President Trump to that trio of American presidents. Actually, there are 4 of them: Lincoln, Truman, Nixon, and now President Trump. He signed the Mission Act. I built the regulations for the Mission Act that said we're no longer using miles. Now, you all live in Southern California. You could be 10 miles from a VA hospital, and that 10 miles, as a crow flies, is only good for a crow because it's going to take you an hour to get there. So we changed the regulation to 30 minutes. And under the Mission Act, it says that if you live more than 30 minutes away from a VA facility, and we don't have the medical service that you need, then we let you take the option of going into the private sector. The second part of that I mentioned is urgent care, keeping our veterans out of emergency rooms and giving them the same benefits that their neighbors have. So when there's a cold or a flu or a fever, they don't have to go through the catharsis of going to an emergency room. They can go to urgent care. That is a benefit that is long overdue, and I thank the President of the United States for putting that in.
This next question is relevant to our second row right here. We have Troy High School sent their Navy JROTC, a small portion of their team, to be here today for your remarks. And this question, I don't know if it came from their commander or whom, but if you had advice to give to high school students wanting to get involved, what would it be?
I will give them Richard Nixon's advice. Study your history and study the language. Nixon used to talk about the problem in directing American foreign policy. He said the problem in directing American foreign policy is that Americans tend to think in terms of 5 years, 5 years forward, 5 years back. The Europeans in terms of generations, the Russians centuries, and the Chinese millennia. About 20 years, almost, not 15 years after President Nixon left the White House, he put that aphorism into practice when he laid out the vision of conflict for this new 21st century. And he focused on China. And he said that in order to combat what was coming from China, a place he had opened up to the world, that we need to steep our young people in the history of their country, what makes this country unique, what makes this country exceptional. And only then can they put in context what is at stake in the global fights that were to come. The other part is this language, the ability to communicate an idea for 330 million Americans. So, I mean, Churchill used to say, I let the smart boys learn Latin for a fashion and Greek for a treat, but I hit them hard if they don't know their English. And what he was saying was we have to be able to convey the ideas, in his case, of British liberty across the world. So I would say, study your history. Think about public service. Think about spending time in the service of others. The military, the foreign service, state and local government. We need new ideas, and Jefferson would have said it more prosaically, but we need that young energy to refresh our liberties from generation to generation. So I say concentrate on history, learn your place in this grand human adventure, and learn why the United States is so special.
Next question, sir. How much effect has President Trump had on improving the health care and benefits of veterans?
That is the question, and I will give you the answer. No president in the history of this country has ever made veterans the centerpiece of first of his campaign and then of his administration. If you look at the president from the time he entered the contest, veterans are in his speeches and his thoughts at every stop. He has allowed me great leeway. He has given me the power of presenting to Congress the largest budget in the history of this department. I am the only member of his cabinet who does not have to provide him with budget cuts. And that is his testament to devotion for America's veterans. I could not be more honored or happier than to have the support that I've had from this president. And, you know, as a businessman, he has probably done more to articulate the very reasons for choice that we need to give our veterans than any past commander-in-chief. And I see that every day.
Thank you, sir. We do have time for one last question, and then we must move on. And that question is, what does being a leader mean to you, and what is the most important thing in leadership?
There's a treatise waiting in that question, but I'll try to give it as simple an answer as possible. You probably know by now that I grew up in the military. General Mattis said that I was born in khaki diapers. I take that as a badge of honor. But I learned from the military those very simple words, service before self, walking the post, seeing the people that you help lead, seeing the people you serve with, knowing their jobs, talking to them, knowing what their needs are, what their concerns are. Now that sounds very sophomoric, but there is a disease that takes hold inside the Potomac River corridor of people, and this is a bipartisan criticism, people who believe because they've been given a fancy title and they get a big office that somehow they have created power and authority, and that all wisdom comes from inside the Potomac. It doesn't. I'll quote Harry Truman about people who shout too loud on Saturday night and pray too loud on Sunday morning. He said, if you encounter that, go home and lock your liquor cabinet immediately. But that applies to people who sit in offices and direct missive after missive to an organization as large as VA. The only way it works is if the organization is led from the bottom up. As a leader, on the military level or on the political level, you have to give general direction and let talented people carry out that vision. I mean, Reagan said there's no telling how far you can advance if you're just willing to allow people to use their talents and if you are not worried about who gets the credit. Know your job. Understand other people's jobs. Know that job in not only an historic context, but in the operation of whatever you do, be it a small business, be it a section or a division on a ship, or an organization like mine that has almost 400,000 people. Walk the post. Learn and talk. And I'll close the answer with something from George Patton that is probably unusual for most people when they think about General Patton. He said the key to a good leader is a leader who hands out more pats on the back than he does kicks in the butt. If you stick by that, you'll probably be all right.
Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Robert Wilkie. Sir, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. God bless you. God bless America. We will see you next time. Follow us at nixonfoundation.org for more upcoming events. Bye-bye.